Thanks, Stuart. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about working age benefits, and to give you a little bit of context for that, we currently spend about roughly £100 billion per year on these benefits. These are cash transfers for those of working age, and that follows a period of steady rises in the period before the financial crisis, a relatively pronounced peak at that point, and then something of a gentle decline since then. And if I show you the same as a proportion of national income, broad patterns are quite similar, but a more marked decline as a proportion of national income since the peak in around 2011, 2012, as national income has grown. So the reasons for that falling back of benefit spending in the last few years, partly helped, of course, by a somewhat recovering economy, also, of course, by a lot of cuts. And I've marked on here the most recent tranche of these, the post-2015 cuts implemented by the Conservative governments, which I think amount to roughly £12 billion a year in current terms, and then the triangles here mark on where spending would be roughly without those. But what are the parties proposing to do? The Conservatives are proposing essentially nothing, to stick with the current plans. But I've laid out in a little table here a summary of a number of measures that the Labour and the Liberal Democrats are proposing to essentially undo some of the cuts that have come in over the last few years or so. And if you just focus first on the ones I've highlighted, those are ones where both Labour and the Lib Dems are agreed they want to get rid of them. The most significant of these, by some distance overall, is to abolish the so-called two-child limit on support that can be claimed by families. That's a fairly big deal. The families affected by this lose, on average, more than £3,500 per year. So for a number of low-income families with at least 3 children, this is pretty significant. The other two measures there not highlighted, let me just very briefly talk about those. So the Liberal Democrats also want to reverse some of the recent cuts to universal credit work allowances. That's the amount you can earn if you're in work on universal credit before you start losing some of your entitlement. Both Labour and the Liberal Democrats want to address the recent delinking of housing benefits, so the support that you can claim for the cost of rent, from the actual cost of rent. So since 2012, those two things have been delinked for private sector tenants, meaning that support for housing costs has fallen behind the cost of housing. Now, in Labour's case, they basically just want to go back to the 2012 system to undo all of that and going forward to resume increasing housing benefits in line with local rents. The Liberal Democrats, they're not going to unpick all of the delinking that's happened over the past few years. They're going to leave that in place, but from this point on, they will once again resume increasing housing benefit in line with rent. So they won't undo the delinking, but they will stop it getting any worse. And that's, in the long run, a very significant measure, and that will continue to grow in size as long as rents continue to grow faster than prices. So I just want to plant a flag for that. That's actually, in the long run, a very, very important measure there. I want to talk a little bit about universal credit specifically. There's a number of things in the manifestos related to universal credit. So just to remind you very briefly of the context, as you all know, this is a huge reform to pretty much all of the working age means-tested benefit system. And as things stand, this is in itself, just rolling it out, is going to be a major challenge for the next government. Despite all the headlines, there's still only about 2.5 million people on claimants of universal credit, and that's set to rise to about 6 million by the end of the next parliament. And just getting that rollout right will in itself be very difficult and fraught with some danger, in particular as current claimants of old benefits get moved over to universal credit. If that doesn't go right, there are risks that people are left without support for a period, or that they do not get some of the transitional support that they would otherwise get during that process. So that in itself is a big challenge ahead. More generally, one of the various reasons why universal credit has caused a lot of controversy and made a lot of headlines is simply that, as well as creating millions of winners, which it does in terms of what people are entitled to in benefits overall, it also creates millions of losers. And in the manifestos, there are some measures that are essentially changing that balance a bit by topping up the generosity of universal credit for particular groups. So in particular, in Labour's case, they want to, there's a proposed increase for some disabled claimants of universal credit. In the Liberal Democrats' case, as well as I've already said, wanting to unwind some of the cuts to work allowances, so that's something that would benefit a number of working families, they also want to introduce a new separate work allowance for second earners in a family. So that's something that would benefit a number of two-earner couples on universal credit. Now, in Labour's case, they've said rather more that could, if taken at face value, certainly would be much, much more significant than any of that in the long run. Now, first of all, they've said that they will essentially slow down the rollout. So what they've said is they will not go ahead with moving claimants of old benefits onto universal credit, which is about to start happening in earnest. That's not the same, by the way, as stopping the rollout or even as pausing it, because that would still mean that new or repeat benefit claimants would move on to universal credit rather than the old benefit. So there would still be a significant increase over time in the numbers claiming UC, but it would represent a slowing down of the rollout. But going beyond that, they've also said that ultimately they want to scrap universal credit entirely and replace it with something different. Very few clues as to what that would mean. There are clearly a number of aspects of universal credit's operation that Labour isn't happy with, and that in the manifesto it has proposed tweaks to try to address, for example, in relation to the rather infamous 5-week wait period that many of you will know about. But beyond things that it thinks can be addressed by tweaking UC itself, it's not so clear what it thinks about the fundamentals of UC are so wrong, and so it's not so clear really what exactly it has in mind when it talks about replacing it entirely. Obviously, without knowing more, it's difficult to say more, other than clearly one thing that is clear is it would be a huge upheaval. This is something that millions of families are already on, millions more are set to be on. It would, if taken at face value, essentially be a commitment to redesign the whole working age benefit system again for the second time in a decade. And that seems unlikely to be much simpler than the last time, than the universal credit reforms themselves. But to come back to the specific benefits pledges that have been made and to see what they do when put together, first of all, just going back to the series for total working age benefit spending, the real term series that I showed you. This is the graph I brought up earlier. Essentially, the sum total of the Labour and the Liberal Democrats' plans would do this. They'd top up the current plans by around about £7 billion a year in current prices, which is equivalent to undoing, in spending terms, about half, a little more perhaps, of the cut since 2015, or another sense of scale, it would take real-term spending back to at about its peak level of around 2011-12, although as a proportion of national income, it would still be a little lower than it was at that point. Okay. And in terms of who this would actually affect, what I can now do is bring together both the cash transfer policies that I've just been discussing with the personal tax policies which Stuart gave you an overview of. So these are the set of policies where we can quite clearly identify who is directly affected by them. And if we do that, we can look at, across the income distribution, the impacts of the parties' plans for that subset of measures. Okay? And you see the expected result, essentially, which is that the benefit top-ups that both Labour and the Lib Dems are proposing would mostly benefit the bottom third or so of the household income distribution. Of course, you've got takeaways from the top under Labour. I will just emphasise, again, this is what it says on the tin. It's personal taxes and benefits. These are things that can quite reliably be traced to impacts on particular households. So it does not include the vast array of other policies, even within the tax and benefit system, for example, all of the corporate tax policies that Stuart's outlined, which clearly are going to affect households somewhere, but we really don't know exactly where. So that's benefits. Now, there's a lot in the manifestos that is really focused on helping people on low and modest incomes that is not about what's happening to cash transfers. And I'm particularly going to focus on the labour market side of that set of policies. And a lot of the backdrop for a lot of that is a particular concern about essentially in-work poverty. And this highlights what that's all about. So this shows you 20 years ago, taking the population who were in poverty at that time and just splitting them out into three very broad types of people. People in a working age household that didn't have anyone in paid work, people in a working age household that did have someone in paid work, and pensioner households. And so back then, about 40% of poverty here was found in working households. Going forward, that's risen to almost 60%. Okay, so there's a big, big change in the nature of who is poor in the UK over time. This is partly because of relatively positive sounding trends in relation to falls in pensioner poverty in particular, and also falls in worklessness amongst the working age population. But it's also because amongst those who are in work, at least this measure of poverty in particular has been gradually trending up. So this shows you a measure of relative poverty after housing costs for the whole population and for people in working households over time. And this is a measure that the Labour Party referred to explicitly in their manifesto. What this essentially shows you is that on this measure, in-work poverty has been gradually trending up for much of the last 15 years or so. So what that basically means is that lower earning working households are struggling to keep up with middle income households. And that poverty rate has now reached 18%. This is useful because you can see one of Labour's pledges in the context of this picture. One of Labour's commitments is to abolish in-work poverty within the next Parliament, within 5 years. So you can see the really dramatic transformation in the income distribution that would imply over an extremely small period. I've already talked about their benefit measures, so perhaps worth saying right up front. We estimate that if you add in all of their benefit top-ups that they've specified, that might get you from about 18% to about 16%. So it might get rid of about an eighth of in-work poverty. Okay, but we'll be looking elsewhere for anything that might make a really big dent in in-work poverty. So bear that in mind as we go forward. So I'm going to start on that note with, I guess, the flagship policy of recent times when it comes to trying to help the low paid. And this is where both parties have very, very bold plans going forward as well, and that is rises in the minimum wage. So here I'm going to take employees aged 21 plus, and first of all show you currently for the population as a whole how many people are on the minimum wage and what that's set to rise to next year, and the answer being about 9% next year. About 9% of employees aged 21 plus next year under current policy are set to be on the minimum wage. Okay, and that's already a significant increase on a few years ago. What the parties plan to do to that number, the Conservatives, by the end of the next Parliament, by 2024, plan to essentially double it. That's because they want to raise the minimum wage to about two-thirds, as they specify, of median hourly wages by that point. That would imply about a doubling of the number of people on the minimum. Labour want to go to £10 an hour from the current level of £8.30 straight away in 2020. And that would imply a trebling of the numbers on the minimum wage. So you can see really huge transformations in the low-wage labour market that this would imply. And this would be particularly big for some groups. So, for example, you take the Labour policy, which is the bigger of the two, it would imply almost a third of all women employees being on the minimum wage, almost a half of all part-time workers being on the minimum wage. That's for everyone aged 21 plus. It's worth giving a little bit more detail on how this actually breaks down by age, and particularly focusing on younger workers, where the proposed changes are actually even more dramatic. So the Conservatives want to extend what is currently the national living wage applying to age 25 plus down to age 21 plus. So that would itself imply a pretty big change in the number of people in that 21 to 24-year-old age group on the minimum. Labour want their £10 minimum wage to go all the way down to age 16. Now, currently, all these groups have different rates. Labour want to apply their £10 minimum wage to all of these groups. And this really is massive. This would, for example, for the youngest employees, 16, 17-year-olds, it would mean that we're going from about 1/8 of them being on the minimum wage now to essentially all of them having their wages set by the government under Labour. And remember, that would happen in one go in 2020, not in increments. So I think that really brings me to the main sort of evaluative point that we would make here, and that we've made several times before. In relation to some extent to both of the parties' plans here, the there is a concern. It's not with the scale of the ambition. For a government that wants to tackle low pay, there's a pretty good case for using minimum wages more. That has been effective so far in boosting low pay, and it also seems not to have resulted in some of the employment risks that people have always worried about when it comes to raising minimum wages. But that's great, but it doesn't change the fact that at some point, beyond some point, if you keep raising the minimum, there is going to be a tipping point where you're making lots of people loss-making to employ and where you would risk their employment. We don't know where that point is. No one does. The international evidence doesn't help a lot either, because we would be pushing the minimum wage essentially to the frontier or beyond of where other countries have gone. So really the risk here is of very, very sudden and large rises, which leave no time for policy to respond if it turns out that we reach that tipping point. No time for policy to respond in order to limit the damage. And I think that's the risk, to some degree, of both parties' plans. Clearly Labour's is bigger and more rapid, and so is more risky in that respect. One other point on the distributional effects of this policy tool that's worth making is that clearly it's a tool that, if used well, is well designed to address low hourly wages for individuals. That doesn't mean that it's particularly well designed at addressing poverty, thought about in a traditional way, in particular in addressing low household incomes. Why are low wages and low household incomes not the same? There are a few reasons. One of the main ones is that a lot of people live with someone else. So, for example, half of minimum wage employees live with a higher earner. And so many of these people are not particularly low household income people. This shows you the distribution of minimum wage employees across household income deciles. And they're really not concentrated at the bottom. They're just as concentrated in the middle. So that's not an argument against using minimum wages as a policy tool in and of itself. It's simply an important point about the distributional effects that you can and cannot expect to materialise from that. Now, I mean, it's almost sort of laughable to have to cover such major other proposals in such a short space of time, but I really must mention that Labour's manifesto in particular goes way, way beyond just minimum wages when thinking about changes to the labour market. They really plan major reforms to labour market institutions and regulations in a number of respects. And I think it's fair to say one quite common thread underlying a lot of the concerns that motivate a lot of that is essentially a concern about the bargaining power of workers, or of certain kinds of workers, especially, I think, lower paid ones. And I mean, that's actually, that's an underlying concern which is kind of reasonable, in that there's good evidence that bargaining power can be an issue in the labour market, and it can be a driver of low pay. So I think that is, it's fair to say, a motivation for a lot of what they're proposing here. And there are a number of policies that might help to address that particular problem. Much higher minimum wages obviously would be one. Others would include a proposal to put worker representatives on boards, and also large-scale sectoral collective bargaining. Now, I think one point that's worth making, and I can make this point using the example of collective bargaining actually, is that a lot of other countries already have very different labour markets to the UK. They organise their labour markets very differently. And so what can sound really radical in the context of a particularly post-1980s UK doesn't sound as radical in the context of what other countries do. If we look at the coverage of collective bargaining agreements across a number of developed economies, you can see the UK here, fourth from bottom, has a relatively low coverage of collective bargaining, essentially just the public sector. And a number of countries that have much more of this are perfectly successful and well-functioning economies and labour markets. And there's been a general trend as well for this to be falling over time. So many places used to have more of this than they do now, and the UK is an absolutely prime example of that. Now, with respect to collective bargaining, there is some quite good evidence that these kinds of arrangements can reduce wage dispersion, which is something that the Labour Party clearly would be keen on. But I think this is also another example, again, of a wider point here about some of their labour market proposals, where a lot of the devil is going to be in the detail. If you look at these countries here, even the ones that just do sectoral collective bargaining, which is what Labour propose, the actual arrangements differ pretty widely in exactly how that's done. And again, as far as the evidence is a good guide, that seems to matter in terms of the pros and cons of different systems. So there is going to be a lot of devil in the detail, I think, in terms of Labour's proposals to really transform the way the labour market in the UK works. Conclusions. So on working age benefits, basically the Conservatives are going to lock in all of the cuts to date and do pretty much nothing. Labour and the Liberal Democrats would undo a number of them. The most significant proposal here, if taken at face value, would be Labour's to completely replace universal credit with something else. But it is really very clear what is really intended there and whether it's actually any more than essentially a rebranding exercise with minor additional tweaks. Who knows? Looking at Labour's manifesto as a whole, they do have this quite precisely stated target to eliminate in-work poverty within 5 years. That's not possible because you're talking about a 5-year timescale. There's only very few policy tools that can have a really transformative impact very, very quickly. Benefits and minimum wages being two of the few. As I've said, the benefit proposals they have would get very, very little of the way there, and minimum wages are just not a tool that's well suited to tackling poverty as opposed to low pay. Now, the bigger picture is that a lot of what they're proposing much more broadly clearly could have a very big impact on the distribution of earnings and incomes in the long term. Wouldn't transform it this radically within 5 years, but clearly could be very, very substantial in the long run. In a way, that's probably the bigger picture point to leave you with. So I'll now pass you over to Christine.